The letter arrived on a Monday, which Agnes would later consider appropriate, because Mondays had always been the day the world reminded her that it could still take things away. She was sitting at the kitchen table of the house she had lived in for 41 years, the house on Harwell Street in Cutters Bay, Oregon, the house her husband Martin had painted every 5 years without fail until the year his hands stopped being able to hold the brush, and then the year after that, when his hands stopped being able to hold anything at all. She was drinking her morning tea from the blue ceramic mug Martin had bought her at a craft fair in 1987, and she was watching a pair of finches on the feeder outside the window, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, which was the closest thing to peace she had been able to manage in the 14 months since Martin had died. The letter was from her son, Gregory. It was not handwritten. It was typed on letterhead from a law office in Portland she had never heard of, and it was signed with Gregory's name in ink that looked like it had been applied quickly, by someone who had other things to get to. The letter informed her, in language that managed to be both precise and evasive, that the Harwell Street property had been listed for sale. Gregory and her daughter, Vivian, acting jointly under the power of attorney that Agnes had signed 6 years earlier during Martin's illness, when she had been too exhausted and too frightened to read the fine print, had engaged a real estate firm in Portland to handle the transaction. The house had been assessed at $310,000. A buyer had already been identified. The closing was scheduled for March 14, 23 days from the date of the letter. Agnes was expected to vacate by March 10. There was a paragraph near the bottom about assisted living options in the Eugene area that Gregory had researched and found to be both affordable and well-reviewed. There was a phone number for a relocation coordinator. There was a sentence that said, "We believe this is in your best interest." Agnes set the letter down on the table. She picked up the blue mug and took a sip of tea that had gone cold while she was reading, and she looked at the finches on the feeder, and she sat very still for a long time. She was 79 years old. She had raised 2 children in this house. She had nursed her husband through 4 years of decline in the bedroom at the top of the stairs, changing the sheets twice a day when it got bad, sleeping in the chair beside his bed because the sound of his breathing had become the only clock she trusted. She had buried him from this house, standing in the front hallway in the black dress she had bought for the occasion because she did not own one, watching the funeral car pull up to the curb while the neighbors stood on their porches and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. She had paid the mortgage on this house for 41 years. She had paid it off entirely in 2011 with the last of Martin's pension distribution, and she had stood in this kitchen holding the final statement and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent her entire adult life making sure the ground beneath her feet was solid. And now her children, the 2 people she had carried and fed and taught and loved with everything she had, were selling that ground out from under her with a typed letter and a relocation coordinator's phone number. She called Gregory that evening. He answered on the 4th ring with the particular tone of a man who had been expecting the call and had already decided how it would go. "Mom, I know this is a lot to process." "Gregory, this is my house." "Technically, Mom, the power of attorney gives Vivian and me the authority to manage your assets, and the house is your primary asset, and frankly, it's too much for you to maintain alone. The property taxes alone are, I have paid the property taxes every year for 41 years, Gregory. I have never missed a payment on anything in my life. That's exactly my point. You shouldn't have to worry about that anymore. The assisted living community in Eugene is really wonderful. Vivian toured it last month. They have a garden, activities, you'd have people around. Agnes listened to her son describe the features of a facility she had not asked about, in a city she had no connection to, with the enthusiasm of a man who had already spent the money in his mind and was now simply managing the transition. She understood, with the cold clarity that comes to people who have been underestimated their entire lives, that this was not about her well-being. The house was worth $310,000. An assisted living facility in Eugene cost approximately $4,500 a month. Gregory and Vivian had done the math the way they always did math, with themselves as the variable that mattered most. "Where is Vivian?" Agnes asked. "She's on board with this, Mom. We discussed it thoroughly." "I didn't ask if she was on board." I asked where she is. She's in Phoenix. She has a conference. Agnes absorbed this. Her daughter, who had co-signed the decision to sell her mother's home of 41 years, was at a conference in Phoenix. Not on the phone. Not in the room. Not anywhere that would require her to look her mother in the eye while the ground was pulled away. Gregory, Agnes said, I am not leaving this house. There was a pause on the line, and when Gregory spoke again, his voice had shifted into something she recognized from his adolescence, the particular register of a person who believes he is being patient with someone who does not understand the situation. Mom, the papers are already signed. The buyer has been approved. The closing is in 3 weeks. This isn't something we're discussing. This is something we're informing you about. Agnes sat in the kitchen of her house, the house she had lived in for 41 years, and listened to her son use the word informing, and she felt something move through her that was not grief and was not anger but was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing, not the front door of the house, not yet, but a door inside her, the one that had always stayed open for her children, the one that had always assumed they would, in the end, see her clearly. That door closed. And in its closing, Agnes felt, for the first time in 79 years, the particular lightness of a woman who no longer needs to be understood by the people she loves. She simply needs to survive them. The house sold on March 14th, exactly as scheduled. Agnes had contacted an attorney of her own, a woman named Helen Tran in Cutters Bay, who had reviewed the power of attorney document and confirmed what Agnes had already suspected. The document was broad, legally binding, and had been drafted by Gregory's attorney 6 years earlier during the worst of Martin's illness, when Agnes had been sleeping 3 hours a night and signing whatever was put in front of her because her husband was dying and the paperwork seemed secondary to keeping him alive. Helen Tran was honest with her. She told Agnes that contesting the sale was possible but would take months and significant legal fees, and that the outcome was uncertain. She told her that the power of attorney could potentially be challenged on grounds of undue influence, but that proving it would require demonstrating that Agnes had been in a diminished state when she signed, which was complicated by the fact that she had been functional enough during that period to manage Martin's care with near-professional competence. Agnes thanked Helen and paid her consultation fee in cash from the envelope she kept in the kitchen drawer, and went home and began packing. She took the blue mug. She took the photograph of Martin from the hallway table, the one from 1979 where he was standing on the porch of this house with paint on his shirt and a look on his face that she had always thought of as specifically hers, a look he never wore for anyone else. She took her winter coat, her good boots, 3 changes of clothes, and the small wooden box Martin had made for her 40th birthday, which contained their wedding rings, a lock of their son Paul's baby hair, a pressed wildflower from the meadow behind the church where they were married, and a photograph of her mother that was so old the edges had gone soft. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the curtains she had sewn, the bookshelf Martin had built into the living room wall, the garden she had tended for 4 decades, she left behind. Not because she didn't care, but because carrying it would have required her to feel the weight of what was being taken, and she could not afford that weight. Not yet. Not while she still had to figure out where she was going to sleep. Gregory had deposited $18,000 into her bank account, her share of the proceeds after the real estate fees, the attorney's costs, and the deductions he and Vivian had taken for what the letter described as management expenses associated with the property transition. $18,000 for a house she had paid off over 41 years. $18,000 for a life. Agnes did not go to Eugene. She did not call the relocation coordinator. She did not visit the assisted living community with the garden and the activities and the people around. She drove instead to the one place in Cutters Bay that had always made sense to her when nothing else did, the waterfront. Cutters Bay had been a fishing town before it became a tourist town, and before it became a tourist town, it had been a cannery town. The waterfront still carried the bones of that history, old pilings crusted with barnacles, rusted rail tracks that had once carried crates of salmon from the processing floor to the docks, and the buildings themselves, a row of abandoned industrial structures that lined the south shore of the bay like a sentence no one had finished writing. Agnes had walked this waterfront with Martin 1,000 times. He had loved the old buildings the way some men love cars or tools, with a specific, mechanical appreciation for how they were put together and what they had been built to do. He had told her stories about the canneries, about the families who had worked them, about the seasons when the salmon ran so thick the whole town smelled of fish and money, and the particular exhaustion of people who worked 18-hour days because the alternative was winter with nothing put by. She parked at the end of Cannery Row, where the road turned to gravel and the gravel turned to broken concrete and the broken concrete turned to beach grass growing through the cracks, and she sat in the car and looked at the last building on the row. It was the Prosser Cannery, or what remained of it. A long, low structure built from timber and corrugated iron, set on concrete pilings above the high tide line, with a loading dock that extended over the water on creosote beams that had turned black with age and salt. The roof had partially collapsed on the east end. The windows along the waterfront face were broken or missing entirely. The walls on the landward side were covered in a dense mat of blackberry bramble that had been growing unchecked for so long it had become structural, actually holding portions of the wall in place that would otherwise have fallen. The Prosser Cannery had been closed since 1971. It had been on the market, off the market, listed as condemned, unlisted, relisted, and finally abandoned by every entity that had ever held title to it. The current owner, according to the county assessor's records that Agnes had looked up at the Cutters Bay Library the previous week, was Clatsop County itself, which had seized the property for unpaid taxes in 2019 and had been trying without success to find someone willing to take responsibility for it ever since. The assessed value was $3. Agnes had stared at that number on the screen for a long time. $3. The county had listed the property at its absolute minimum legal value because the cost of demolition, estimated at $45,000, exceeded any conceivable sale price, and the county wanted the liability off its books. $3 for a building that had once employed 60 people and processed 200,000 pounds of salmon a year. $3 for a place that had fed families and built futures and stood on the waterfront of Cutters Bay since 1924. Agnes drove to the county assessor's office the following morning. She paid $3 in cash. The clerk, a young woman who looked at Agnes with the particular expression reserved for elderly people doing things that seem inadvisable, processed the paperwork and handed Agnes the deed with a look that fell somewhere between pity and bewilderment. Agnes folded the deed carefully, put it in the inside pocket of her winter coat, and drove back to the waterfront. She parked in the same spot. She got out. She walked across the broken concrete and the beach grass to the front of the Prosser Cannery, and she stood at the main door, which was a wide sliding panel on a rusted rail that had not moved in decades, and she put her hand flat against the corrugated iron and felt the cold of it, and the age of it, and the specific stillness of a building that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. Then she found the side entrance, a personnel door on the landward wall, partially obscured by the blackberry bramble but still accessible if you knew where to look, and she turned the handle, and the door opened, because nobody had bothered to lock a building worth $3. She stepped inside. The interior of the Prosser Cannery was a single vast space, roughly 4,000 square feet, divided by support columns that ran the length of the building like a spine. The processing floor was still mostly intact, poured concrete stained dark with decades of fish oil and salt and the particular patina of industrial use that never fully washes away. The overhead beams were massive Douglas fir timbers, 12 inches square, spanning the full width of the building without intermediate support, the kind of structural engineering that modern builders would call overbuilt and that Agnes recognized immediately as the work of someone who intended the building to outlast them. The light inside was extraordinary. It came through the broken windows along the waterfront face in long, angled shafts that caught the dust and the salt air and turned the interior into something that looked, in certain moments, almost deliberate, as though someone had designed the ruin for beauty rather than simply allowing it. The loading dock end of the building was open to the bay, the large cargo doors having long since rusted off their tracks, and through that opening Agnes could see the water, gray and flat in the March morning, and the far shore of the bay, and a heron standing motionless on a piling, looking at nothing with the concentrated patience of a creature that understood waiting in ways humans rarely did. Agnes walked the length of the building slowly, her boots echoing on the concrete in a way that made the space feel both enormous and intimate. She noted the things that were wrong: the collapsed section of roof on the east end, the standing water beneath it, the rusted remains of the canning equipment bolted to the floor along the south wall, the electrical panel on the west wall that had been disconnected and stripped of its copper wiring years ago by someone who had valued the metal more than the building. She noted the things that were right: the structural beams, sound and straight despite the decades, the concrete floor, cracked but level, the foundation pilings visible through the gaps in the floor at the dock end, still solid, still holding. She noted the walls, the waterfront windows that could be reglazed, the personnel door that still worked, the corrugated iron siding that was rusted but fundamentally intact. And then she noticed something she had not expected. At the far west end of the building, behind the last row of support columns, set into the back wall where the cannery met the hillside, there was a door. It was not like the other doors in the building. The main entrance was industrial, a sliding panel built for forklifts and crate dollies. The personnel door was standard commercial hardware, steel frame, hollow core. This door was different. It was heavy timber, fitted into a timber frame that had been built into the back wall with a precision that stood out sharply against the utilitarian construction of the rest of the building. The door was secured with a padlock, a heavy brass padlock that had gone green with oxidation but appeared, from where Agnes stood, to be intact. And across the face of the door, someone had nailed a sheet of tin, covering the entire surface from frame to frame, sealing whatever was behind it away from the main floor of the cannery. Agnes stood in front of that door and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, not yet. Something before hope. Something closer to the feeling she had when she looked at a row of numbers and sensed, before she had done the calculation, that they were going to add up to something significant. She put her hand against the tin sheeting. It was cold, and behind it, beyond the timber and whatever else lay between her and the space on the other side, she felt nothing. No draft, no vibration, no sound. Whatever was behind that door had been sealed completely, deliberately, and a long time ago. Agnes stood there for several minutes. Then she stepped back, and looked at the door the way she looked at everything that mattered, carefully, patiently, and with the particular attention of a woman who had spent her entire life noticing things that other people walked past without seeing. She did not try to open it. Not yet. She had learned, over 79 years of quiet observation, that the most important things revealed themselves on their own schedule, and that forcing them open before you understood what you were looking at was the surest way to miss what they were trying to show you. She turned and walked back through the length of the cannery, past the rusted equipment and the broken windows and the shafts of salt-filtered light, and she stepped out through the personnel door into the March afternoon, and she stood on the broken concrete and looked at the building she had just bought for $3. And she thought about Martin, who had loved these old buildings, who had understood what they were built from and what they were built for, and who would have looked at this particular building and seen exactly what Agnes was beginning to see. Not ruin. Possibility. She got in her car. She drove to the hardware store on Main Street and bought a sleeping bag, a camp stove, a flashlight, a box of matches, and a padlock of her own. Then she drove back to the cannery, carried her supplies inside, found the driest corner of the processing floor, the one farthest from the collapsed roof section and closest to the sealed door at the back wall, and she set up what would become, for the next several months, her home. That first night, she lay in the sleeping bag on the concrete floor and listened to the sounds of the building around her. The wind off the bay found the gaps in the corrugated siding and played them like an instrument, a low, shifting hum that rose and fell with the gusts. The water beneath the loading dock slapped against the pilings in a rhythm that was almost regular, almost predictable, but never quite. Somewhere in the walls, something small moved and then was still. And from behind the sealed door at the back of the building, 12 feet from where Agnes lay, there was nothing. Absolute silence. Absolute stillness. A room holding its breath. Agnes closed her eyes. She was 79 years old. She was sleeping on a concrete floor in a condemned cannery she had purchased for $3. Her children had sold her home and divided the proceeds and sent her a check for $18,000 and a phone number for a relocation coordinator. Her husband was dead. Her house was gone. Her savings were a number that got smaller every time she looked at it. She had nothing that the world outside this building would recognize as a plan. But she had a roof, most of one, over her head. She had a door she had not yet opened. And she had the particular, irreducible stubbornness of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped noticing it and simply kept going. She pulled the sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. She listened to the bay, and the wind, and the silence behind the sealed door. And she slept. The first week taught Agnes things about herself that 79 years of conventional living had never had occasion to reveal. She learned that she could wake at 5 in the morning on a concrete floor with her hips aching and her shoulders stiff and her breath visible in the cold salt air, and still get up. She learned that a camp stove and a tin pot and a bag of oatmeal purchased carefully from the grocery store on 10th Street constituted a breakfast that was entirely sufficient when eaten slowly, in silence, watching the light come across the bay through the broken waterfront windows. She learned that the particular loneliness of sleeping in an abandoned building was different from the loneliness of sleeping in a house where your husband had died, different in texture, different in weight, and in some ways she could not fully articulate, easier to carry. The loneliness at the house on Harwell Street had been the loneliness of absence, of a chair that should have been occupied, of a voice that should have answered when she spoke. The loneliness of the cannery was something else. It was the loneliness of a cleared space, of a room swept empty, of a life stripped down to its most basic elements and waiting, without pressure, without expectation, to see what would grow in the open ground. She began cleaning on the second day. Not because she had a plan, but because she was Agnes Morrow, and Agnes Morrow did not sit in disorder when she had hands and a back that still worked in daylight that was going to pass whether she used it or not. She started at the personnel door and worked her way east across the processing floor with a broom she had bought at the hardware store and a pair of work gloves she had found in the glove compartment of her car, left there by Martin years ago, still shaped loosely to his hands. She swept decades of debris into piles, then carried the piles out through the personnel door in a plastic bucket, one trip at a time, dumping them on the gravel strip behind the building. Broken glass. Rusted metal fragments. The desiccated remains of things that had once been paper or fabric or wood and had been reduced by time and salt air to a uniform gray powder that rose in clouds when she swept it and settled on her coat and in her hair and tasted faintly of the sea. It took her 3 days to clear the main floor. Her body protested every hour of it, specific complaints from specific joints and muscles that she catalogued with the detached precision of a woman who had spent 4 years managing her husband's physical decline and understood the difference between pain that meant stop and pain that simply meant this is hard. She stopped when she needed to. She drank water. She sat on the edge of the loading dock with her legs hanging over the bay and watched the herons and the cormorants and the slow passage of fishing boats heading out through the channel, and she let her back unknot itself in its own time. On the 4th day, a man appeared at the personnel door. He was perhaps 65, tall and weathered in the way of men who had spent their lives near salt water, with a gray beard trimmed close and hands that looked like they had been used for serious work for a very long time. He stood in the doorway and looked at Agnes, who was on her knees scrubbing a section of the concrete floor with a brush and a bucket of water she had carried from the public restroom at the marina 200 yards up the waterfront, and his expression moved through several stages of confusion before arriving at something that looked like reluctant respect. "You're the one who bought the Prosser," he said. It was not quite a question. Agnes sat back on her heels and pushed a strand of hair off her forehead with the back of her gloved hand. "I am. For $3. That's correct." He looked around the interior of the cannery with the practiced assessment of someone who understood buildings. His eyes moved along the roof timbers, down the support columns, across the floor to the collapsed section on the east end, and back. "I'm Dale O'Shiro," he said. "I've got the boat repair shop 4 buildings up. I've been watching you haul buckets back and forth for 3 days. He paused. "You living in here?" Agnes considered several possible answers and chose the one that was true. "Yes." Dale Oshiro absorbed this without visible judgment. He looked at the sealed door at the back of the building, then back at Agnes. You know what's behind that? Not yet. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are recalculating something. My father worked here, he said. 1959 to 1966, when the old man shut the place down. Einar Prosser, Norwegian, built the whole operation himself in the 20s. My father said he was the most particular man he'd ever worked for. Everything in its place, everything maintained, everything documented. When he closed the cannery, he didn't just walk away. He spent 3 months shutting it down properly, cleaning the equipment, filing the records, settling every account. My father said he'd never seen anyone close a business with that much care. He looked at the sealed door again. That room back there, Einar sealed it himself the week before he locked the front door for the last time. My father asked him what was in it. Einar said it was the only thing in the building that wasn't the bank's business. Agnes looked at the door from across the processing floor. The tin sheeting nailed across its face. The green brass padlock. The timber frame built with a precision that did not match anything else in the building. Did anyone ever try to open it? She asked. Dale shook his head. Einar's family held the property until the 90s, then it went through a couple of investment groups who bought it thinking they'd redevelop the waterfront. None of them lasted long enough to get past the permits. County took it for taxes 5 years ago. Nobody cared enough about the building to look. He paused again, and something in his expression shifted. You need a water hookup, he said. You can't keep hauling buckets from the marina. I know. I've got a line at my shop that runs off the municipal main. I can run a temporary connection to your building for the cost of the pipe and the fittings. Maybe $40 in materials. Agnes looked at this man she had met 4 minutes ago, standing in the doorway of her $3 building, offering to solve one of her most immediate problems with the matter-of-fact generosity of a person who understood need without requiring it to be explained or justified. Why would you do that? She asked. Dale looked at her with a directness that reminded her of Martin. Because my father loved this building, he said. And because anyone who buys a condemned cannery for $3 and starts scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees at 79 years old is either out of her mind or the most determined person on this waterfront. Either way, I'd like to see what happens next. Agnes almost smiled. She was learning that smiling came back slowly, like circulation returning to a hand that has been held too tight for too long. $40, she said. I can manage that. Dale came back the next morning with pipe and fittings and a toolbox that looked like it had been in active service since the 1980s, and by noon Agnes had running water at a utility sink he installed against the west wall, cold only, fed by a garden hose that ran along the outside of the building from his shop. Insulated with foam pipe wrap he happened to have in his truck. It was not elegant. It was functional. And the first time Agnes turned the tap and watched clean water run into the basin and down the drain, she stood there longer than she needed to, feeling the simple reality of it, water in a place she was making habitable, evidence that what she was doing was not entirely impossible. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that Agnes recognized from much earlier in her life, from the years when her children were small and the days had a structure dictated not by ambition but by necessity. She woke early. She worked. She ate simply. She slept hard. She did not think much about Gregory or Vivian during the daylight hours, because the daylight hours were full of problems that required her hands and her attention, and there was a particular mercy in that fullness. She thought about them at night, in the sleeping bag on the processing floor, when the work was done and the building was dark except for the flashlight she kept beside her pillow and the ambient light from the marina that came through the waterfront windows in a pale orange wash. She thought about Gregory's voice on the phone, the word informing. She thought about Vivian in Phoenix, at a conference, unreachable and perhaps deliberately so. She thought about the $18,000 and the relocation coordinator and the assisted living community in Eugene with its garden and activities and people around. She thought about these things and she felt the particular pain of a mother who has given everything and received a typed letter in return, and then she turned on her side and looked at the sealed door at the back of the building, barely visible in the dark, and she let the pane sit where it was without trying to make it smaller or larger than it actually was. She was learning that about grief. It did not respond to management. It responded to acknowledgement. You could not organize it or file it or make it add up to a clean figure at the bottom of a column. You could only let it be the size it was and keep going. March became April. The weather shifted, not dramatically. This was the Oregon coast, where the sky maintained a committed relationship with gray that no amount of calendar turning could disrupt, but the edge came off the cold, and the rain, which had been sharp and horizontal in the March winds, became softer, more vertical, the kind of rain that soaked you slowly rather than all at once. Agnes repaired the east section of the roof. This was not something she had ever done before, and she would not have attempted it without Dale, who appeared at irregular but reliable intervals with materials and expertise and the particular patience of a man who understood that teaching someone to do something was more valuable than doing it for them. They spent 4 days on the roof, Agnes handing up corrugated iron panels that Dale cut to size with tin snips and screwed into the existing timber framing. The panels were salvaged from a warehouse demolition in Astoria that Dale had heard about through the network of waterfront people who kept track of such things, and they had cost Agnes nothing beyond the gas money for Dale's truck and a lunch she insisted on buying at the diner on 5th Street, which Dale accepted with the quiet discomfort of a man who preferred to give rather than receive. When the last panel was in place and the east end of the cannery was closed to the weather for the first time in years, Agnes stood on the processing floor and looked up at the repaired section and felt something settle in her chest. The building was holding. She was holding. These two facts were becoming difficult to separate. She cleaned the waterfront windows next, the ones that were still intact, removing years of salt crust and grime with vinegar and newspaper, a method her mother had used and her mother's mother before that, a lineage of women who cleaned windows with what they had and did not wait for what they didn't. When the glass was clear, the light inside the cannery changed entirely. It came in clean and full from the bay and filled the processing floor with a quality of illumination that made the old space look like something it had not looked like in decades. Something possible. Something inhabited. Something worth the trouble. She set up a proper living area in the southwest corner of the building, near the utility sink and the sealed door. Dale helped her frame a simple partition from salvaged lumber, 8 feet long and 6 feet high, creating a space that was small but private, shielded from the main floor and from the drafts that still found their way through the siding. Inside the partition she placed her sleeping bag on a folding cot she had purchased at the thrift store in town for $12, a small table made from a plywood offcut and 2 stacked cinder blocks, the camp stove, and the wooden box Martin had made for her 40th birthday, which she set on the table beside the flashlight and the blue ceramic mug, which had survived the drive and the weeks on the concrete floor and every indignity of her current circumstances without so much as a chip. She was spending carefully, tracking every dollar in a small notebook the way she had tracked the household accounts for decades, the way she had tracked Martin's medical expenses, the way she tracked everything, because Agnes Morrow believed that knowing exactly where you stood, even when where you stood was precarious, was better than the particular anxiety of not knowing. Her balance, after the roof materials, the cot, the camp stove fuel, the groceries she bought once a week at the store on 10th Street, and the $40 for Dale's water connection, was $17,411. She looked at that number every evening in the notebook and understood exactly what it meant. It meant she had time, but not unlimited time. It meant she could sustain this life for months, but not years. It meant that whatever the sealed door at the back of the building contained, she would eventually have to open it, because the cannery as it stood was a shelter, but it was not a future. The door waited. Agnes looked at it every day, sometimes several times a day, the way you look at a letter you know is important but have not yet opened. She examined the tin sheeting, the brass padlock, the timber frame. She ran her hands along the edges where the door met the wall and felt the care with which it had been sealed, every gap filled, every joint tight. Whoever had done this, Einar Prosser, according to Dale's account, had not been hiding something in haste. He had been preserving something with intention. She began to research. The Cutter's Bay Library was a small, well-maintained building on 2nd Street, staffed by a woman named Patricia who had been there for 31 years and who possessed the particular superpower of small-town librarians, the ability to find any piece of local information ever committed to paper, regardless of how obscure or how long ago it had been filed. Agnes told Patricia she was interested in the history of the Prosser Cannery, and Patricia, who had heard about the $3 purchase through the town's efficient informal communication network, looked at Agnes with an expression of frank curiosity and said she would see what she could find. What she found, over the course of 3 visits, was considerable. Einar Prosser had arrived in Cutters Bay in 1921, a Norwegian immigrant with a degree in marine biology from the University of Oslo and a practical knowledge of fish processing that he had acquired working in the sardine canneries of Stavanger as a young man. He had built the cannery in 1924 with financing from a group of Scandinavian investors in Portland, and he had operated it successfully for 42 years, employing as many as 60 workers during peak salmon season and earning a reputation as both the most exacting and the most fair employer on the Oregon coast. He paid above the going rate. He maintained his equipment to a standard that bordered on obsessive. He kept records of everything: production volumes, water temperatures, salmon migration patterns, equipment maintenance schedules, weather observations, employee hours, and financial transactions, all documented in the meticulous hand of a man who believed that information carefully recorded was information preserved against the chaos of time. But the detail that caught Agnes's attention, the detail that made her sit up straighter in the wooden chair at the library reading table, was a series of entries in the Cutters Bay Historical Society newsletter from the early 1960s. Einar Prosser had been more than a cannery operator. He had been, quietly and without public fanfare, one of the most knowledgeable collectors of Pacific Northwest maritime artifacts on the Oregon coast. He had spent decades acquiring navigational instruments, ship's logs, cartographic documents, and maritime art from estate sales, private collections, and the families of retired fishermen and merchant sailors throughout the region. He had published 3 articles in regional historical journals on the subject of early Pacific coast navigation, and he had corresponded with curators at the Smithsonian, the Peabody Essex Museum, and the Oregon Historical Society about items in his collection that were, according to the letters Patricia found in the Historical Society's files, of considerable scholarly interest. One letter, dated 1963, from a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, described several items Einar had offered for examination as genuinely significant contributions to the documented history of Pacific Coast maritime exploration and potentially among the most important primary source materials related to early Oregon coast navigation that we have encountered in private hands. The letter urged Einar to consider donating or lending the items for public exhibition. There was no record of Einar's response. And in 1966, 3 years after that letter was written, Einar Prosser had closed the cannery, sealed a room at the back of the building, and never spoken publicly about its contents again. Agnes sat in the library with the newsletter copies spread before her and the curator's letter in her hands, and she felt the particular electricity of a pattern emerging from what had previously looked like random data. She thought about the sealed door. She thought about the timber frame and the brass padlock and the tin sheeting. She thought about a man who had spent decades collecting maritime artifacts of genuine historical significance, who had been urged by the Smithsonian to share his collection with the world, and who had instead sealed it in a room at the back of his cannery and locked the door and left it there for 60 years. Why? What had made him choose preservation over exhibition, secrecy over recognition, the sealed room over the museum? Agnes did not know. But she was beginning to understand that the answer was behind that door, and that the door was not simply a barrier. It was a decision Einar Prosser had made, a deliberate act of trust in the future, a belief that whatever he had preserved would be found by whoever was meant to find it, whenever the time was right. She drove back to the cannery that afternoon with the copies Patricia had made for her and sat on the edge of the loading dock with her feet hanging over the water and read through them again, slowly, in the late afternoon light. The bay was flat and silver. A seal surfaced 30 yards out, looked at her with mild disinterest, and submerged again. Agnes held the Smithsonian letter and looked at the sealed door, visible through the open cargo bay, and felt something she had not felt since January. Direction. Not a plan, not yet. But the sense of a thread connecting where she was to somewhere she had not yet been, a thread that ran through the sealed door and into whatever Einar Prosser had spent his life collecting and protecting and ultimately choosing to leave behind. She needed to open that door. She was almost ready. But there was one more thing she needed to do first. She picked up her phone. She had signal here at the waterfront, reliable signal, 2 bars most of the time, 3 on clear days. She had been avoiding this call for weeks, not because she was afraid of it, but because she had wanted to wait until she could make it from a position of something other than desperation. She wanted to make it from the loading dock of her own building, with the bay behind her and the work of her own hands around her and the sealed door waiting at her back. She dialed. It rang 4 times. "Mom?" Vivian's voice carried the particular weight of a woman who knows she has done something she cannot undo and has been waiting for the phone to ring. "Where are you?" "Gregory said you didn't go to Eugene." I'm in Cutter's Bay," Agnes said. "I bought a building on the waterfront. I'm living in it." Silence. "Mom, what do you mean you bought a building?" "I mean I bought a building. It was $3. $3? "Mom, that's not how, Vivian," Agnes said, and something in her voice must have carried the weight of everything that had happened since January, because her daughter stopped talking. "You and Gregory sold my home. You sold it without my understanding and without my consent in any way that matters, and you divided the money and sent me to a facility I didn't ask for, and you did all of this without once sitting across from me and looking me in the eye." The silence on the line was absolute. "I am not calling to argue about it," Agnes continued. "I am calling to tell you where I am, because I am your mother, and you should know. I am on the waterfront in Cutter's Bay. I am safe. I am working. And I am not coming to Eugene." She paused. "If you want to see me, you know where I am." She ended the call. She sat on the loading dock and watched the light change on the water, silver to gray to the deep blue-black that the bay turned in the last minutes before. Dark, and she felt the specific relief of a woman who has finally said exactly what she meant without softening it for anyone's comfort. The seal surfaced again, farther out this time, and Agnes watched it and thought about Einar Prosser, who had spent his life on this waterfront, who had built something real with his own hands, who had sealed away what mattered most and trusted the future to find it. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would open the door. The morning she opened the door was a Tuesday in the second week of May, and the bay outside the cannery windows was doing something Agnes had never seen it do before. The fog had come in overnight the way it always did on the Oregon coast, thick and white and absolute, erasing the far shore and the channel markers and the fishing boats at their moorings, reducing the world to the building she was standing in and the water immediately beneath it and nothing else. But as the sun climbed somewhere above the fog layer, the light began to filter through in a way that turned the interior of the cannery into something that felt almost sacred, diffuse and golden and directionless, as though the light were not coming from any particular place but simply existing, the way warmth exists in a room after a fire has been burning for hours. Agnes stood in front of the sealed door with Dale beside her. She had asked him to be there, not because she needed help with the physical act of opening it, but because she had learned over the past 2 months that certain moments require a witness, someone to stand beside you and confirm that what you are seeing is real, that the ground beneath you is solid, that you are not dreaming this. Dale had brought a pry bar and a pair of bolt cutters. The bolt cutters made short work of the brass padlock, which fell away in 2 pieces, the shackle separating from the body with a sound like a small bell being struck once and then silenced. The tin sheeting required more effort. It had been nailed at close intervals along all 4 edges, and Agnes and Dale worked their way around the perimeter with the pry bar, pulling each nail free with a sound that was part screech and part sigh, the sound of metal releasing its grip on wood after holding on for 58 years. The tin sheet came away in one piece, and Dale leaned it carefully against the wall, and they stood looking at the timber door beneath. It was beautiful. Agnes had not expected that. Under the protective tin, the wood had been preserved almost perfectly, a dense, dark timber that she would later learn was old-growth Port Orford cedar, one of the most durable and rot-resistant woods in the Pacific Northwest, chosen deliberately by a man who understood that what he was sealing away would need to survive decades of coastal climate without deterioration. The door had no handle. It had a brass latch, similar to the padlock in its green patina but mechanically sound, and a keyhole fitted with a brass escutcheon plate engraved with a single letter, P. Agnes reached into the pocket of her coat, the winter coat she had worn every day since January, and took out a small brass key. She had found it 11 days earlier, tucked inside the spine of a maintenance ledger in the cannery's old office area, a small closet-sized space near the personnel door that she had been cleaning out methodically over the previous week. The ledger had been Einar Prosser's, its pages filled with the same meticulous handwriting described in the Historical Society newsletter, columns of figures and dates and equipment serial numbers recorded with the precision of a man who believed that careful documentation was a form of respect for the work itself. The key had been taped to the inside of the back cover, wrapped in a small piece of oilcloth, with a note in Einar's hand that read simply, "For the room. When you are ready." Agnes had carried the key in her coat pocket for 11 days. She had held it in her hand on the loading dock in the evenings, feeling its weight, its specificity, the fact that it had been placed exactly where someone who was taking the time to truly know this building would eventually find it. Not hidden. Preserved. Left for the person who would care enough to look. She put the key in the lock. It turned with a resistance that was brief and then gave way entirely, the mechanism releasing with a clean, definitive sound that Agnes felt in her wrist and her forearm and somewhere deeper than either of those places. She looked at Dale. Dale nodded once. She pushed the door open. The air that came out of the room was cool and dry and carried a smell that Agnes recognized immediately because it was the smell of her father's study when she was a girl, the smell of old paper and wood and the particular stillness of a space where important things have been kept carefully for a very long time. The room was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 10 feet by 12, built from the same Port Orford cedar as the door, lined floor to ceiling with shelving that had been constructed with a craftsmanship that made Agnes stop in the doorway and simply look. The shelves were fitted, not nailed, joined with dovetails and pegs in the manner of furniture rather than utility storage, and they were filled. Every shelf, from floor level to the ceiling beams, was occupied. Agnes stepped inside. The fog-filtered light from the processing floor came through the open door behind her and filled the room with the same diffuse golden illumination, and in that light she saw what Einar Prosser had spent his life collecting and his last act as a businessman to preserve. The shelves along the left wall held navigational instruments. Brass sextants in fitted wooden cases, octants with ivory scales, ship's chronometers housed in gimbaled mahogany boxes with glass lids through which Agnes could see the faces, still legible, still precise. A telescope in a leather tube, its brass fittings darkened but intact. A set of dividers and parallel rulers in a velvet-lined case. A compass, not a pocket compass but a ship's binnacle compass, mounted in a brass housing that had been polished at some point in its history to a mirror finish and had retained enough of that finish in the sealed room's stable atmosphere to catch the light and throw it back in a warm, gold arc across the ceiling. The shelves along the right wall held documents. Flat archival boxes, the kind used by museums and libraries for the preservation of paper materials, stacked horizontally and labeled in Einar's handwriting with dates and descriptions. Agnes read the nearest labels without touching them. Ship's logs, Bark Helena, Portland to San Francisco, 1847 to 1851. Cartographic survey, mouth of the Columbia, original manuscript, 1826. Correspondence, Hudson's Bay Company, Fort Vancouver, 1831 to 1844. Navigational charts, Oregon coast, hand-drawn, pre-territorial, 1839 to 1842. Agnes read these labels and felt her hands begin to tremble, not from cold, not from weakness, but from the particular physical response of a woman who has spent her life paying attention to details and has just encountered details of a magnitude she was not prepared for. She understood, in the immediate and non-negotiable way that understanding sometimes arrives, that she was looking at primary source documents from the earliest period of European exploration and settlement of the Oregon coast. Documents that predated Oregon's statehood. Documents that, if authentic, represented a collection of maritime historical materials that no one outside this room had seen or known about for nearly 6 decades. But it was the back wall of the room that stopped Agnes completely. The back wall held paintings. 8 of them, unframed, mounted on the cedar shelving with brass brackets that held them upright and slightly away from the wood to allow air circulation, a preservation technique that spoke to Einar's understanding of how to keep oil paint and canvas stable over long periods. The paintings were maritime scenes, rendered in a style that Agnes could not immediately place but that carried a quality she recognized from the few times Martin had taken her to the Portland Art Museum, a quality of light and attention and technical command that separated serious art from decoration. Ships under sail in coastal waters she recognized as the Oregon coast. A harbor scene that might have been Astoria in the mid-19th century. A storm off a headland painted with a violence and specificity that made Agnes take a step back involuntarily, as though the wave breaking across the canvas might actually reach her. And in the lower right corner of each painting, a signature she could not read from where she was standing but that appeared to be the same hand on all 8 canvases, a name she did not recognize but that had been signed with the confidence of a person who knew the work was good. Agnes stood in the center of the room for a long time. She did not count the minutes. She was aware of Dale standing in the doorway behind her, silent, giving her the space that the moment required. She was aware of the fog light moving slowly across the walls as the sun climbed higher outside. She was aware of her own breathing, steady and deliberate, the breathing of a woman who is holding herself together not because she is falling apart but because what she is seeing is so much larger than what she expected that she needs a moment to let her body catch up with her mind. She turned to Dale. His face carried an expression she had never seen on him, the expression of a man who has spent his life on this waterfront and thought he understood everything it contained and has just discovered he was wrong. "Dale," Agnes said quietly. "I need to make some phone calls." The authentication process took 3 months, and during those 3 months, Agnes learned more about what Einar Prosser had built in his sealed room than she had learned about anything in her previous 79 years of life. The first call she made was to Patricia at the library, who listened to Agnes's careful description of what she had found and was silent for so long that Agnes thought the connection had dropped. Then Patricia said, "Don't touch anything else. I'm calling the Oregon Historical Society." The Oregon Historical Society sent a field assessor named Dr. Thomas Nakamura, a maritime historian who had spent 23 years cataloging Pacific Northwest nautical collections and who arrived at the cannery on a Thursday morning in late May with 2 archival cases and the carefully controlled demeanor of a man who had been told something extraordinary and was prepared to be disappointed. He was not disappointed. Agnes watched his face as he moved through the room, examining each shelf, each instrument, each document box, with the focused intensity of a professional encountering something that exceeded his professional framework. He spent 40 minutes with the navigational instruments alone, turning each one in his gloved hands, reading the maker's marks, checking the calibration mechanisms, noting the serial numbers in a leather-bound field journal he carried in his breast pocket. When he reached the document boxes, he opened only one, the one labeled Cartographic Survey, Mouth of the Columbia, Original Manuscript, 1826, and he stood looking at what was inside for so long that Agnes, who was watching from the doorway, began to wonder if he was all right. He looked up at her, and his expression had changed. The professional control was still there, but beneath it was something she recognized because she had felt it herself when she first entered the room. The vertigo of encountering something you knew was possible but never believed you would actually see. "Mrs. Morrow," he said, "do you understand what this document appears to be?" "Tell me," Agnes said. "This appears to be an original manuscript survey of the Columbia River Bar, hand-drawn by a British cartographer attached to the Hudson's Bay Company expedition of 1826. If it is authentic, and based on the paper stock, the ink composition, and the cartographic style, I believe it very likely is. It is one of fewer than 3 known original surveys of the Columbia Bar from before the establishment of the Oregon Territory. The other 2 are held by the British Admiralty Archives in London and the National Archives in Washington, D.C." He paused. This document alone, if fully authenticated, would be valued conservatively at between $2 and $4 million. Agnes sat down on the small stool that Einar Prosser had placed in the corner of the room, the stool she had not noticed until that moment, a simple wooden seat positioned as though Einar had anticipated that whoever opened this room might need to sit down. The full authentication took the rest of the summer. Dr. Nakamura brought colleagues from the Smithsonian, from the Peabody Essex Museum, from the University of Oregon's Special Collections Department. They came in pairs and small groups, and they moved through Einar Prosser's sealed room with the reverent efficiency of people who understood they were in the presence of something genuinely rare. The navigational instruments were authenticated and catalogued over 6 weeks. The collection included 14 sextants dating from 1790 to 1855, 7 of which were made by identified London instrument makers whose work was already represented in major museum collections. The ship's binnacle compass was identified as a piece made by E.S. Ritchie and Sons of Boston, circa 1860, one of approximately 20 known examples from that maker and period. The chronometers, 3 in total, were authenticated as marine timekeepers by Arnold and Dent, the firm that had supplied chronometers to the Royal Navy during the age of Pacific exploration, and their estimated combined value, based on comparable sales at Christie's and Sotheby's maritime auctions, was placed at $1.8 million. The document collection was larger and more significant than even Dr. Nakamura's initial assessment had suggested. Einar Prosser had acquired, over the course of 40 years of careful and knowledgeable collecting, one of the most comprehensive private archives of Pacific Northwest maritime primary sources ever assembled. The ship's logs alone covered 37 vessels operating on the Oregon coast between 1831 and 1889, including 12 vessels for which no other operational records were known to exist. The correspondence files contained letters between Hudson's Bay Company factors and their London directors that filled gaps in the historical record that scholars had been trying to close for decades. The cartographic materials, 7 original manuscript charts and surveys predating 1850, were described in Dr. Nakamura's preliminary report as a collection of national significance. The paintings were the last to be authenticated, and they were the element that transformed the story from remarkable to extraordinary. An art historian from the Smithsonian American Art Museum identified the signature on all 8 canvases as that of Cleveland Rockwell, a 19th-century painter who had served as a lighthouse keeper and customs inspector on the Oregon coast and who was considered one of the most important early documentarians of the Pacific Northwest maritime landscape. Rockwell's paintings were held by the Smithsonian, the Oregon Historical Society, and a small number of private collectors, and they rarely came to market. The 8 paintings in Einar's sealed room, several of which depicted coastal locations and vessels not represented in any known Rockwell work, were appraised collectively at $6.4 million. The total appraised value of the contents of the sealed room, as compiled by Dr. Nakamura and his colleagues over the course of the summer and presented to Agnes in a formal report delivered in September, was $22.7 million. Agnes read the number in the report and set it down on the table in her living area and looked at it the way she looked at all significant figures, with the careful, methodical attention of a woman who understood that numbers of that size carried responsibilities that were equally large. She thought about Einar Prosser, who had known the value of what he had collected, who had been contacted by the Smithsonian in 1963 and urged to share it, and who had instead sealed it in a room built from the most durable wood he could find and locked it with a brass lock and covered it with tin and left it for the person who would buy a ruined cannery for $3 and care enough to find the key in the spine of a maintenance ledger. She understood, sitting in the cannery with the fog coming in off the bay and the report in her hands, that Einar had not hidden his collection from the world. He had hidden it from the bank. The cannery had been financed by investors, and when Einar closed the business in 1966, those investors had claims on the assets of the operation. Every piece of equipment, every fixture, every item on the premises was subject to the creditor's inventory. But the sealed room had been built as an addition to the original structure, on land Einar owned personally rather than through the business, and its contents had never been listed on any business inventory or asset declaration. Einar had protected his life's work the only way available to him, by sealing it away from the legal process that would have dispersed it, and trusting that time would eventually deliver it to someone who would understand what it was and what it deserved. The news traveled the way significant news travels in small coastal towns, completely and with remarkable speed. Within a week of Dr. Nakamura's report, every person in Cutter's Bay knew what Agnes Morrow had found in the back of the Prosser Cannery, and within 2 weeks, Gregory and Vivian knew as well. Gregory called first. Agnes was on the loading dock, her feet over the water, watching the evening light on the bay, when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. She let it ring 4 times, not out of spite but because she wanted to be sure she was ready, and then she answered. "Mom." Gregory's voice was different. The confidence was still there, the particular register of a man accustomed to directing conversations, but beneath it was something new, something Agnes recognized because she had heard it before in the voices of people who had just realized they had made a mistake they could not undo. "Gregory. I heard about the cannery. About what you found." "Yes. Mom, that's incredible. That's really, truly incredible. I'm so happy for you." Agnes listened to her son say the word happy and measured it against the typed letter on the law firm letterhead and the word informing and the $18,000 check and the relocation coordinator's phone number, and she found that the word did not weigh very much at all. "What is it you want, Gregory?" There was a pause. "I want to help. Vivian and I have been talking, and we think you're going to need support managing something like this. Legal counsel, financial planning, security for the collection. These are complicated matters, Mom, and we have resources and connections that could." "Gregory," Agnes said, and her voice was quiet and even and carried the weight of a woman who had spent a winter on a concrete floor and rebuilt a roof and found a key in a ledger and opened a door that had been sealed for 58 years, all while her children were dividing the proceeds of her sold home and congratulating themselves on their practicality. "You sold my house. You sold it while I was still living in it, and you sent me a check for $18,000 and a phone number for a facility in Eugene, and you did it with a typed letter because neither you nor your sister could bring yourselves to sit across from me and say it to my face." She paused. "I bought this building for $3. I slept on the floor. I carried water in buckets. I repaired the roof with salvaged metal and learned to do things I had never done in my life, and I did all of it without your help, without your resources, without your connections, and without your permission." The bay was turning dark. A fishing boat was coming in through the channel, its running lights cutting clean lines across the black water. "I don't need your help, Gregory. I have never needed your help. What I needed was your respect, and you gave me a relocation coordinator instead." The silence on the line lasted a long time. "Mom, I'm sorry." It was, Agnes noted, the first time he had said it. Not the first time he had expressed regret or acknowledged difficulty or used language that gestured in the direction of apology without arriving there. The first time he had actually said the words. "I know you are," Agnes said. "And I want you to understand that I am not saying this to punish you. I am saying it because you need to hear it, and because I have spent 79 years making things easier for other people, and I am finished doing that when it requires me to make myself smaller." She looked out at the bay, at the last light on the water, at the fishing boat sliding into its berth at the marina with the practiced ease of something arriving exactly where it belonged. "If you want to visit, you are welcome. If you want to see what I built here, I would like to show you. But you will come as my son, not as my manager. And you will never again make a decision about my life without sitting across from me and looking me in the eye. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mom," Gregory said, and his voice was smaller than she had ever heard it, and for the first time in a very long time, it sounded like the voice of the boy she had raised, the boy who used to sit on the kitchen floor and watch her cook and ask her questions about everything, the boy who had somewhere along the way become a man who thought efficiency was the same thing as love. "Good," Agnes said. "Come for dinner on Sunday. Bring Vivian. I'll make chowder." She ended the call and sat on the loading dock and listened to the bay and felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph. Not vindication. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She felt like herself. Entirely and without apology, like herself. Agnes did not sell the collection. She considered it carefully, the way she considered everything, with the notebook and the figures and the particular discipline of a woman who had tracked every dollar of her life and understood that money was a tool, not a destination. She established the Prosser Maritime Heritage Trust, funded by a partial and carefully structured sale of selected items from the collection to institutional buyers, the Smithsonian, the Oregon Historical Society, and the Peabody Essex Museum, each of which acquired pieces that filled specific gaps in their existing holdings at prices that were fair and thoroughly documented. The remaining collection, including 4 of the 8 Rockwell paintings, the majority of the archival documents, and the ship's binnacle compass that Agnes had loved from the first moment she saw it throw its gold arc of light across the ceiling of the sealed room, remained in Cutter's Bay. Agnes converted the cannery into a maritime heritage center, using a portion of the proceeds to complete the restoration of the building under Dale O'Shea's supervision, preserving the original Douglas fir timbers and the concrete processing floor and the waterfront windows and the sealed room itself, which became the centerpiece of a permanent exhibition documenting Einar Prosser's life and collection. The Heritage Center opened in the spring of the following year, on a morning when the bay was flat and blue and the fog had burned off early and the light through the restored waterfront windows fell across the old processing floor in long, clean shafts that made the space look exactly the way Agnes had always known it could look. Dale stood at the back of the room during the opening ceremony with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that he would have described, if anyone asked, as satisfaction, though it was clearly something considerably larger than that. Patricia from the library was there, and Dr. Nakamura, and Ruth from the hardware store who had sold Agnes her first bag of work gloves and had watched without comment as a 79-year-old woman walked out of her store carrying supplies for a life that nobody believed was possible. Gregory came. He stood near the waterfront windows with his hands in his pockets and looked at what his mother had built, and Agnes saw on his face the specific expression of a man who was understanding, slowly and all at once, that the person he had dismissed was the person he should have been paying attention to all along. Vivian came. She brought flowers, which Agnes accepted and placed in a jar on the reception desk without comment, because some gestures are too late to mean what they want to mean but too sincere to refuse entirely. Agnes stood on the loading dock that evening after everyone had gone, her feet hanging over the water the way they had hung over the water on the first evening she had sat here, when the cannery was a ruin and the sealed door was still closed and her balance was $17,411 and the future was a word that had stopped meaning anything she recognized. The bay was doing what the bay always did at this hour, turning from blue to silver to the deep, quiet dark that settled over the water like a held breath. A heron stood on the same piling where a heron had stood on the first morning she walked into the building, motionless, patient, watching the water with the concentrated attention of a creature that understood waiting was not passive. It was the most active thing you could do. Agnes thought about Einar Prosser, who had sealed a room and trusted the future. She thought about Martin, who had loved these buildings and never got to see what this one became. She thought about the blue ceramic mug, still on her table, still unchipped, still holding her morning tea every day in a building she had bought for $3 and turned into something that mattered. She thought about the key in the spine of the ledger and the note in Einar's hand that said, "For the room. When you are ready." She had been ready. She simply hadn't known it until the world had taken everything else away and left her standing in front of a door with nothing to lose and the particular, unbreakable stubbornness of a woman who had been underestimated for the last time. She was 79 years old. She had been sold out of her own home by her own children. She had spent $3 on a building everyone else had called worthless. She had slept on concrete and carried water in buckets and repaired a roof and found a key and opened a door that had been sealed since 1966, and behind it she had found not just a collection worth millions but the evidence of something she had needed far more than money. The evidence that the things the world considers finished, the buildings it condemns, the women it relocates, the doors it seals and forgets, are not finished at all. They are waiting. And the people who dismiss them, who sign the papers and make the calls and type the letters and use the word informing as though it were a kindness, those people are not as clever as they believe themselves to be. Because the things they throw away have a way of becoming the most valuable things in the room. Agnes sat on the loading dock of the Prosser Maritime Heritage Center and watched the last light leave the bay and felt the building behind her, solid and restored and full of the preserved work of a man who had trusted her before he ever knew her name. She felt complete. Not because the money had come or the collection had been authenticated or the children had apologized or the world had finally seen what she was capable of. She felt complete because she had built this. With her own hands. On her own terms. In her own time. And no one, not her children, not the county assessor, not the relocation coordinator, not the world that had looked at her and seen a number instead of a woman, could take that away from her. Because it was hers. It had always been hers. She had simply needed a $3 cannery and a sealed door to find out. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.